Billy had known nothing but coldness in his short life. The orphanage had been a place of despair, filled with the muffled cries of children who felt just as abandoned and lonely as he did. Days blended into one another in a haze of gray, where laughter was a distant memory and warmth was a luxury reserved for those who had families. The creaking floors and peeling wallpaper seemed to seep despair, and every corner held a whisper of forgotten dreams. When Mr. Lawrence arrived with a promise of adoption, Billy's heart fluttered with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Mr. Lawrence was a tall man, exuding an aura of quiet power. He had a calm, almost unsettling demeanor, but he was kind. He spoke to Billy with an oddly soothing voice, offering him a chance to escape the grim confines of the orphanage. Billy's mind raced with visions of a new life, one filled with warmth and comfort. The journey to Mr. Lawrence's home felt surreal. The car glided through thick forests, where shadows danced beneath the trees, and the sun struggled to penetrate the dense foliage. Finally, they arrived at an enormous mansion, a grand estate that loomed like a dark sentinel in the woods. It was magnificent yet intimidating, with its towering spires and ivy-clad walls. The sun was reluctant to cast its rays on this place, which seemed to exist in a perpetual twilight. Inside the mansion, Billy was struck by its sheer size. It was both beautiful and terrifying, filled with dark wood paneling and ornate chandeliers that flickered like candlelight. The air was heavy, laden with an unsettling stillness. The hallway stretched on endlessly, adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to gaze down at him with judgmental eyes. Their expressions were a mix of disdain and curiosity, as if they were assessing his worthiness. As he was shown to his room, a sense of dread settled in. The space was luxuriously appointed, but it felt hollow. The bed was large and inviting, but the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight loomed ominously in the corners. It was a space that should have offered comfort, but instead, it felt like a trap. As night fell, Billy lay beneath the heavy velvet covers, listening to the silence that enveloped the house. It was too quiet, too still. That first night, he heard it, a faint sound, a soft giggle echoing through the walls. Billy's heart raced as he strained to listen, convinced he must have imagined it. But no, it was real. The laughter danced on the edge of his perception, playful and taunting. He sat up in bed, his breath catching in his throat, trying to convince himself it was just the wind or the house settling. But the giggling continued, a haunting melody that filled the dark corners of his mind with dread. In the nights that followed, the disturbances grew more pronounced. He would hear the soft pitter-patter of footsteps down the hallway, but when he opened the door, there would be nothing there. The whispers of children drifted through the air, always just out of reach, as if they were watching him from the shadows. He would catch fleeting glimpses of small figures darting just beyond the edge of his vision, children, perhaps, but always just out of sight. Each time he turned to confront them, the figures vanished, leaving behind a chilling sensation that he was not alone. On one particularly haunting night, Billy woke to the sound of soft sobbing. It seemed to come from the end of his bed. Blinking in the dim light, he struggled to adjust his eyes, and as he did, he saw a girl standing silently at the foot of his bed. Her dress was old and torn, her skin pale and almost translucent. Her eyes were wide and hollow, filled with a sadness that cut through him like ice. Billy's heart raced, and before he could scream, she vanished into thin air. Panicking, he dashed to Mr. Lawrence's study, his voice trembling as he recounted his experiences. "Sir, there's something in the house. I hear children. I see them." Mr. Lawrence looked up from his papers, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. "Billy, my boy, this house is very old. It creaks and groans. You're still adjusting. Your mind is playing tricks on you. Now, go back to bed." His dismissive tone only fueled Billy's fears. He returned to his room, trembling with uncertainty. The days that followed were a blur of unease and terror. The apparitions grew bolder, appearing more frequently, their eyes dull and lifeless. They would stand in the hallways, watching him, their expressions blank as if they were waiting for something. Desperate for an explanation, Billy confided in Mrs. Hawkins, one of the nannies who had always shown him kindness. He told her everything, the whispers, the visions, the girl who had stood at his bedside. Mrs. Hawkins listened, her expression shifting between sympathy and a deeper understanding that unsettled him. "These old houses hold memories, Billy," she said, her voice calm but her eyes betraying something darker. "Nothing here will harm you. You're safe." But that night, sleep eluded him entirely. The house felt alive, pulsating with a strange, malevolent energy. Every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind made his skin crawl. He lay in bed, wide awake, when suddenly the temperature dropped. A sharp, icy draft blew through the room, even though the windows were tightly shut. Then, the singing began. It was a haunting, tuneless melody that wrapped around him like a cold shroud. Shadows began to shift, forming into shapes, figures rising from the darkness, their faces twisted in agony. They were children, but their forms were grotesque, their bodies marred by wounds and deformities. They reached for Billy, their hands grasping at him as if pleading for salvation. He scrambled to the corner of the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please, leave me alone," he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. One child, a boy with sunken cheeks and wide, terrified eyes, stepped forward. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and he pointed behind Billy. Shivering, Billy turned to see Mr. Lawrence standing in the doorway, his figure shrouded in shadow. Mr. Lawrence's eyes glinted with a predatory light. "You've seen them, haven't you, Billy? My other children, the ones who came before you." Billy's heart raced. The room felt as if it were closing in around him. "What do you mean?" he stammered, confusion and fear flooding his mind. "You were never meant to be saved, Billy. You were brought here for a reason," Mr. Lawrence said, his voice low and menacing. He stepped closer, and the darkness seemed to swirl around him. Before Billy could react, Mr. Lawrence lunged forward, grabbing him with a grip that felt like iron. He dragged Billy through the twisting corridors of the mansion, descending deeper into the bowels of the house than he had ever been before. The air grew colder and more oppressive, and Billy felt a sense of dread enveloping him like a shroud. They arrived in the basement, a dark, cavernous space lined with ancient symbols and flickering candles that cast eerie shadows on the walls. In the center stood an altar, stained dark with what looked like blood. Billy's stomach churned at the sight, and a deep, instinctual fear took root within him. "This house has power, boy," Mr. Lawrence hissed, his voice a whisper that sent shivers down Billy's spine. "And you will give it the last sacrifice it needs." Billy screamed, thrashing against Mr. Lawrence's hold, but it was futile. The man's strength was inhuman. Just as the blade gleamed in Mr. Lawrence's hand, the temperature in the room plummeted, and Billy felt a surge of energy around him. Suddenly, the children appeared, dozens of them, surrounding Mr. Lawrence. Their eyes, once dull and lifeless, burned with an intensity that filled the room with electric energy. They moved as one, their ghostly hands reaching out, fingers curling with the rage of the forgotten. The air crackled with their silent fury. Mr. Lawrence's face twisted in terror. He screamed as the children lunged at him, their hands tearing into him, ripping at his flesh. It was a gruesome spectacle, his cries echoing through the chamber, swallowed by the darkness. Billy could only watch in horror as the man who had brought him into this nightmare was overwhelmed, pulled apart by the very souls he had tried to control. As the last piece of him fell to the ground, the children turned toward Billy. Their faces were no longer contorted in anguish, but radiated a serene calmness. The girl from his bedside stepped forward, her voice gentle yet firm. "You're safe now. We couldn't save ourselves, but we saved you." Billy could only watch as the children slowly faded into the darkness, their souls finally at peace. The mansion, once filled with dread and malice, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving an echo of tranquility behind. But for Billy, the scars of his experience would never heal. He left the mansion at dawn, the weight of the dead following him as he stepped into the sunlight, the cool morning air filled with the bittersweet scent of pine. He walked into the forest, the trees whispering secrets of the past, never looking back. His life would never be the same. The darkness that had touched him in that mansion would haunt him forever, a reminder that some memories linger long after the shadows fade. As he stepped into the world beyond the woods, he felt the weight of all those lost souls on his shoulders, a burden that would shape his life in ways he could not yet understand. Days turned into weeks as Billy tried to adjust to the outside world. The sun felt brighter, the air fresher, but the echoes of that night haunted him. He often found himself staring blankly at the ground, flashes of the children's faces flickering in his mind. He was free, yet he felt the chains of their sorrow binding him tighter. He was placed in a new home, a foster family who tried to show him kindness. They were warm and loving, but Billy felt like an outsider, a ghost drifting through their lives. He would often excuse himself to spend hours alone in his room, lost in memories of the mansion that refused to leave him. The laughter of the children and the anguished cries of Mr. Lawrence replayed in his mind, creating a haunting symphony that echoed through his thoughts. At night, he would lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. He thought of the girl with the sad eyes and the boy who had pointed at Mr. Lawrence. Were they at peace? Did they find what they were looking for? Or were they still trapped in that cursed house, waiting for someone to remember them? One evening, unable to sleep, Billy wandered into the living room where the family had gathered for a movie night. The flickering screen cast shadows on their faces, laughter spilling into the room like a warm embrace. He felt a pang of longing, but also a deep sense of isolation. He didn't belong here. As he turned to leave, a flash of movement caught his eye, a flicker of shadow in the corner of the room. He paused, heart racing, and saw a child's face staring back at him from the hallway. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. "Did you see that?" he blurted out, panic rising in his chest. The family turned to him, confusion etched on their faces. "See what, honey?" one of the parents asked, concern creeping into their voices. Billy hesitated, uncertainty gnawing at him. "Nothing," he muttered, retreating to his room. He lay in bed, trembling as the shadows danced around him. The laughter of the family faded, replaced by the soft whispers of the children, calling out to him, drawing him back into the darkness. As the days turned into months, the visions continued to plague him. Each night, he would hear the giggles, the whispers, and sometimes the soft sobbing that echoed through the walls of his new home. He tried to ignore them, but they grew more persistent, more desperate, until he could no longer shut them out. One stormy night, as the wind howled outside and rain battered the windows, Billy sat on his bed, feeling trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within him. He could hear the whispers growing louder, calling his name, urging him to listen. He felt drawn to the darkness, as if it were a siren's call. Gathering his courage, he stood up and made his way to the front door. The wind whipped through the cracks, beckoning him outside. He stepped into the tempest, the cold rain soaking him instantly, but he felt alive, invigorated by the storm. As he wandered through the pouring rain, he felt a presence beside him. The girl appeared, her face now clearer, her expression a mix of longing and desperation. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Billy's heart raced. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the wind. "We are trapped," the girl said, her voice breaking. "You must remember us. You must help us find peace." Billy's chest tightened as he felt the weight of their sorrow crashing down upon him. He remembered the altar, the darkness of the basement, the pain of their lost lives. "How can I help you?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "Return to the house," the girl urged, her voice trembling. "Free us from our pain. Only you can do it." As she spoke, the storm seemed to intensify, swirling around him in a chaotic frenzy. He felt a surge of energy, a pull toward the mansion that had once held him captive. With a resolve he didn't fully understand, he turned and ran through the rain, the wind at his back, guiding him toward the darkness that had haunted him for so long. The journey felt endless, but soon the mansion loomed before him, its dark silhouette standing stark against the stormy sky. Lightning illuminated its features, revealing the ivy that clung desperately to its walls. He felt an overwhelming urge to step inside, to confront the ghosts of his past. As he crossed the threshold, the air grew heavy and cold. The darkness enveloped him, whispering secrets and promises. He felt the familiar presence of the children, their sorrow mingling with his own. In the grand foyer, he paused, listening. The giggles echoed around him, swirling like a tempest, and he closed his eyes, allowing their voices to wash over him. He could feel their pain, their longing for freedom. They were waiting for him to act. He made his way through the winding halls, the portraits watching him with hollow eyes. The house felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to respond to his presence. He knew where he needed to go. The basement door loomed before him, heavy and foreboding. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open and descended into the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of decay and old secrets. The altar awaited him, a grim reminder of the horror that had unfolded here. Billy stepped forward, heart racing, and knelt before the altar. He closed his eyes and focused on the children, channeling their energy, their grief. "I will help you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I promise." As he spoke, the room grew colder, shadows swirling around him. The children materialized, their faces a mix of hope and despair. They gathered around him, their presence filling the space with a palpable energy. The girl stepped forward, reaching out to him, her eyes pleading. "Remember us," she urged, her voice echoing in the dark. "Help us find peace." Billy opened his eyes, looking around at the faces of the children. They were lost, trapped in a cycle of torment. He felt a surge of determination. "I will not abandon you," he declared, his voice steady. "I will free you." With that, he reached for the altar, feeling its cold surface beneath his fingers. He began to chant, words spilling from his lips, an incantation he didn't know he knew. The air crackled with energy as the shadows twisted and writhed, responding to his call. The children joined in, their voices intertwining with his, creating a haunting melody that filled the room. The energy surged, a whirlwind of power enveloping them. The shadows thickened, swirling around them in a violent dance, and Billy felt himself being pulled deeper into the darkness. The altar glowed with an otherworldly light, illuminating the faces of the children as they reached out to him, their eyes filled with gratitude and longing. As the energy peaked, the shadows began to dissipate, and the cries of anguish that had haunted the mansion faded into silence. The children were free, their spirits released from the chains of the past. The girl turned to Billy, her expression serene. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. "You have set us free." With that, she and the others began to fade, their forms shimmering like the first light of dawn. Billy watched, tears streaming down his cheeks, as their faces transformed into peaceful smiles. They were no longer trapped. They were free. The room grew quiet, the darkness lifting like a heavy fog. Billy knelt in silence, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. The burden of their sorrow had been lifted, and in its place was a sense of peace he had never known. As he stood to leave, he glanced back at the altar, knowing it would never hold the same darkness again. The mansion felt different now, the air lighter, as if the walls themselves breathed a sigh of relief. He stepped out into the hallway, the sunlight breaking through the windows, illuminating the shadows that had once consumed him. He walked through the mansion one last time, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin and the lightness in his heart. The portrait seemed to smile down at him, no longer filled with judgment, but with understanding. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. With every step, he felt the weight of the past fall away. As he crossed the threshold and stepped into the world outside, he knew he would carry the memories of the children with him, but they would no longer haunt him. They were free, and so was he. Billy left the mansion behind, stepping into the future with hope. The sun shone brightly above him, and the world felt full of possibilities. He had faced his fears, confronted the darkness, and emerged stronger. The shadows of the past would always linger, but he was no longer afraid. He was free to live, free to love, and free to be himself. As he walked away from the mansion, the forest whispered secrets of renewal and rebirth. The laughter of the children echoed in the distance, a reminder that even in the darkest of places, there is always a glimmer of hope waiting to break through.